one shaky eyewitness, a blurry video, and a judge who never questioned the verdict until a hidden confession landed on his desk and changed everything. It should have been a normal day. That's what Elijah Palmer kept telling himself as he sat in the defendant's chair, wrists shackled, heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. He could still hear the faint whispers in the courtroom, the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes pressing against his skin like heavy stones. He wasn't supposed to be here. Elijah Palmer, you have been found guilty of armed robbery. The judge's voice rang out, deep and unwavering. The court sentences you to 60 years in state prison without the possibility of parole. 60 years. His mother gasped behind him. His sister let out a cry so sharp it cut through the silence like glass shattering on a hard floor. Elijah didn't move. He just sat there, numb, watching as his life collapsed around him like a house built on sand. They had no real evidence. A grainy surveillance video that barely showed the suspect's face. An eyewitness who hesitated before pointing him out in the lineup. A public defender who had too many cases on his plate and too little time to fight for him. And yet, none of that mattered. Judge Richard Calloway didn't hesitate when he delivered the sentence. He barely even looked at Elijah before closing the case and moving on to the next one. To him, Elijah was just another statistic, another case file on a long list of criminals he had to put away. But what Calloway didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Elijah Palmer was innocent. And the man who actually committed the crime, he was still out there, walking free. But innocence isn't enough to stop a prison cell from closing. And for Elijah, that nightmare was just beginning. The courtroom was ice cold, but Elijah felt like he was burning alive. Every breath felt heavier than the last. His lawyer, if he could even call him that, sat beside him, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The man had barely spoken to him before the trial, barely looked him in the eye when he gave half-hearted reassurances. "It's a tough case, Elijah," he had said the day before, "but we'll do what we can." We'll do what we can. What did that even mean? The prosecutor, a sharp-suited man with a slick way of speaking, had painted Elijah as a criminal before the jury even had a chance to think for themselves. Elijah Palmer entered the store that night wearing a black hoodie, gloves, and a mask. He pointed a gun at the cashier and demanded money, the prosecutor declared, voice steady and sure. The suspect then fled the scene with over $3,000 in cash. Elijah's stomach twisted. It wasn't true. None of it. The grainy surveillance footage played on the courtroom screen. The man in the video was his height, his build, but the face, you could barely make out any features. The mask covered most of it, the lighting was bad, and yet, somehow, they all saw what they wanted to see. "That's him," the eyewitness, an older white man, said from the stand. He didn't sound certain. There was a pause, a hesitation, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Yeah, that's him." Elijah wanted to scream. "You think?" His lawyer objected, weakly. The judge overruled it. The trial continued. Elijah's alibi was simple. He was at home that night, alone, watching TV. There was no phone record, no security footage to back him up, just his word, and his word wasn't good enough. The jury took just under 4 hours to decide. Guilty. Elijah had barely processed the word when Judge Calloway called him forward for sentencing. "I've spent years in this courtroom," the judge said, his voice level and firm, "and if there's one thing I know, it's that actions have consequences. This was a violent crime, one that put an innocent man's life in danger." Elijah clenched his fists. The only innocent man in danger was him. "For that reason, I am sentencing you to 60 years in state prison." His mother's sobs broke through the silence. His sister buried her face in her hands. "Elijah?" He felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He turned, looking for someone, anyone, to tell him this was all a mistake. But no one did. The gavel hit the desk. The bailiffs moved in. And just like that, Elijah Palmer's life was over. But what the judge didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the real criminal was closer than they thought. And soon, the truth would come knocking on his door. The first night inside felt like drowning. The cold, hard mattress beneath him, the smell of sweat, rust, and something stale lingering in the air. The distant sound of metal doors slamming shut, voices yelling, footsteps echoing down the halls. Elijah lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself this wasn't real, but the rough texture of the thin blanket against his skin told him otherwise. The cuffs on his wrists hours earlier, the orange jumpsuit they'd forced him into, the looks from other inmates sizing him up, all of it was real. He was here, and he wasn't getting out. The next morning, reality hit even harder. Breakfast was a tasteless pile of something gray on a tray. The guards moved like clockwork, barely looking at the men they herded through the halls. The prisoners carried a quiet, simmering tension. Some walked alone, heads down, while others grouped up, whispering, watching, waiting. Elijah kept to himself. He wasn't interested in making friends. He wasn't interested in enemies either. He just wanted to survive. Days blurred together. The weight of his sentence pressed down on him like a stone, heavier with every passing hour. 60 years. He tried not to think about it. He tried not to count the years he'd lose, the birthdays, the holidays, the life he'd never get back. But there were reminders everywhere. The letters from his mother, written with careful words, as if she didn't want to break his spirit more than it already was. The way the guards barely looked at him when they did roll call, like he was already forgotten. The nights he lay awake, hearing the whispers of men planning things in the dark, fights, escapes, revenge. Then there were the fights he couldn't avoid. He wasn't a troublemaker, but trouble didn't care. It found him anyway. One afternoon in the yard, a group of men surrounded him near the fence. He didn't know them, didn't owe them anything, but that didn't matter. "You look like you don't belong here," one of them said, grinning, cracking his knuckles. Elijah didn't answer. He knew better. It didn't matter. The first punch came fast. He hit the ground, tasting dirt and blood, arms raised as more fists rained down. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, maybe a lifetime. The guards didn't step in until it was over. Back in his cell, face swollen, ribs aching, he stared at the wall. He thought about how easy it would be to give up, to let this place turn him into someone else. But then he thought about his mother, his sister, the life he still wanted, the freedom he still prayed for, even though he had no reason to believe in miracles. Elijah Palmer wasn't a criminal, but in here, innocence didn't mean a damn thing. But outside these prison walls, something was happening. And the man who put him here, he was about to learn a truth that would change everything. Judge Richard Calloway never thought about his cases after sentencing. He prided himself on being decisive, firm, a man of the law. Once the gavel hit the desk, it wasn't his concern anymore. That's how it had always been. But for some reason, Elijah Palmer's case stuck with him. Maybe it was the way the young man had just sat there when the sentence was handed down. No outburst, no pleading, just stillness, as if he knew nothing he said would change the outcome. Or maybe it was the letter Calloway found on his desk one evening, long after the courthouse had emptied. It was from a public defender, not Palmer's lawyer, but someone else, someone who had taken an interest in the case. "Judge Calloway, there's something you need to see." Attached was a case file. At first, Calloway barely skimmed it. Another so-called wrongful conviction claim. Another file from someone trying to overturn a case based on new evidence. He'd seen plenty before, but then a name caught his eye. Devin Mathers, a repeat offender. Armed robbery, possession of stolen property, resisting arrest. A known gang affiliate. And according to a recent confession, the real gunman in the robbery Elijah Palmer had been convicted for. Calloway frowned, flipping through the pages. Mathers had been arrested on an unrelated charge, and during questioning, he had admitted to committing the crime that sent Palmer to prison. The confession had been buried in a stack of reports, never flagged, never sent to the right people. Calloway's stomach turned. He flipped further, scanning the original case. The shaky eyewitness, the grainy footage, the rushed defense. He swallowed hard. He had sentenced an innocent man to 60 years. The thought sent a chill down his spine. How many others? He pushed the file away and rubbed his face with his hands. He could ignore it, pretend he never saw it. That would be the easy thing to do. But for the first time in his career, Judge Calloway felt something gnawing at him. Guilt. Because now he wasn't sure if he was the man he always believed himself to be. And if he was wrong about Elijah Palmer, how many other innocent men had he buried beneath the weight of his sentences? But fixing his mistake wouldn't be simple. because in the world of law, undoing a conviction was much harder than delivering one. And Calloway was about to find out just how deep the resistance ran. Judge Calloway had spent decades in courtrooms, but he had never felt the weight of a case like this before. His job had always been about closing cases, not reopening them. But this wasn't just about a mistake. It was about an innocent man losing his life to a system that he had helped uphold. And now that system was pushing back. Calloway reached out to the district attorney's office first. The response was cold. The case is closed, they told him. Palmer had his trial. The jury made their decision. He brought up the confession from Devin Mathers. The DA barely looked at it. A convict trying to cut a deal happens all the time. But what if he's telling the truth? Calloway shot back. The DA sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, even if this confession is legit, it's not enough. You think a judge reopening an old case makes the system look good? It makes us look sloppy. Sloppy. That was the real issue, wasn't it? Nobody wanted to admit they had sent an innocent man to prison. Nobody wanted to tear open a closed wound. It wasn't about justice. It was about keeping the machine running smoothly. But Calloway wasn't letting this go. He took the case to the public defender's office next. Unlike the DA, they wanted to help, but they were drowning in cases, understaffed, overworked. The process isn't easy, one of the attorneys explained. To overturn a conviction, we need a judge willing to grant a motion for a retrial. But even then, the DA can block it. The appeals court can reject it, and the system, well, it doesn't like to admit it's wrong. Calloway had spent his entire career believing in that system, but now he was seeing it for what it really was. He filed the motion anyway. It was denied. He pushed harder. Another denial. Meanwhile, Elijah Palmer sat in a 6x8 cell, unaware that the very man who had sentenced him was now the only person fighting for his freedom. Calloway started making noise. He reached out to journalists, legal activists, anyone who would listen. The story started spreading. Judge reopens old case, believes wrongful conviction occurred, and that's when the threats started. Phone calls, letters, warnings from fellow judges. You're making yourself look bad. This is dangerous territory, Richard. You really want to be the guy who puts doubt in the justice system? But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He requested an emergency hearing. This time, the courts had no choice but to listen. And for the first time in 5 years, Elijah Palmer was going back to court. But walking back into a courtroom didn't guarantee justice. And for Elijah, the fight wasn't over yet. Elijah Palmer sat in the courtroom, his wrists no longer in shackles, but the weight of the past 5 years sat heavier on him than steel ever could. He had stopped hoping for justice a long time ago. Hope had only gotten him hurt. But now, the same judge who had stolen his freedom was the only man fighting to get it back. Judge Calloway sat across from him, his face unreadable. The same gavel that had condemned Elijah to 60 years now rested in his hands again. But this time, something was different. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the back rows, cameras waiting to capture whatever happened next. Elijah's mother clutched a tissue in her hand, eyes red from prayers and tears. His sister sat beside her, jaw clenched so tight it looked like she might shatter. The prosecution wasn't giving up easily. We see no reason to revisit this case, the DA argued. A jury convicted Mr. Palmer. His sentence was legal. This so-called confession is unreliable, and reopening the case would set a dangerous precedent. Calloway listened, silent, unmoving. Then Elijah's public defender stood up. The real danger isn't reopening this case, she said, voice steady. The real danger is what happens if we don't. An innocent man has spent 5 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. If that doesn't shake your faith in the system, I don't know what will. The courtroom was still. Calloway inhaled slowly. Then he spoke. 5 years ago, I sat in this very courtroom and handed down a sentence that I believed was just. I was wrong. A hush fell over the room. I failed Elijah Palmer, Calloway continued, looking directly at him for the first time in years. This court failed him, and it is my duty to correct that mistake. He turned to the DA. The motion for retrial is granted. The words didn't hit Elijah right away. It felt like they were meant for someone else. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he expected another gavel strike, another door slamming shut. But instead, he felt his mother's hand grip his shoulder, heard his sister let out a breath she had been holding for years, and then the moment that changed everything. This court vacates the conviction of Elijah Palmer. A sharp gasp. Then silence. Then chaos. His mother broke down in sobs. His sister clung to him, whispering, "You're free. You're free." Elijah didn't move. Couldn't move. 5 years. 5 years stolen. He had dreamt of this moment, prayed for it, but now that it was here, he didn't know what to do. The guards at his side hesitated, as if they too were struggling to process it. The man they had been ordered to watch, to lock away, was no longer a prisoner. He was free. Calloway's hands gripped the bench in front of him. He had spent years believing himself to be a fair man, a righteous judge. But now, all he saw in himself was the damage he had done. As Elijah turned to walk out of that courtroom, not through the back door where they had taken him in cuffs, but through the front, where his family was waiting, Calloway did something he had never done before. He stood, and he watched. Because sometimes, justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes, it's about making things right. How many innocent men are still sitting behind bars, waiting for justice that may never come? How many cases were rushed? How many lives were stolen? All because the system values conviction rates over the truth. This isn't just Elijah Palmer's story. It's the story of hundreds, thousands of people who never got their second chance. It's time we start asking the hard questions. It's time we start demanding real justice. Because the next innocent man might not be a stranger. It might be your brother, your father, you.